Dr. Joseph MOYSIUK. Thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup, all the way from your office in Manitoba, Canada. You are a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist, as well as the curator of paleontology and geology at the Manitoba Museum. You have led and taken part in fieldwork across Canada that have unearthed troves of new soft-bodied fossil species from the dawn of animal life, including the wondrous animals from the distant Cambrian period, which we'll be talking about today. Welcome to Evolution Soup, Joe. Well, it's been quite a whirlwind of attention that the new Cambrian discovery Mosura has generated. It must be gratifying as a scientist to see all the interest in this fossil.
Thanks very much for having me on the show here. And yes, it is very gratifying to see all of the attention that we've been receiving in the media. I've been doing lots of interviews and sharing our work and sharing some of the great illustrations that we've had created of this animal. As a museum professional, communicating our science with the broader public is a huge part of our role. So it's great to see that there's so much interest from the general public in what we're doing. And also, a lot of people think of paleontology as being mainly a study of dinosaurs. So it's nice to see something other than dinosaurs getting the spotlight occasionally.
Before we talk about the discovery of this new species and the time period in which it arose, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Joe, where did you grow up, and what were the things that fascinated you and led you to the work that you're doing now?
So I'm from Toronto originally. I grew up in the west end of the city, and I was always one of these bug kids that was going down getting on all fours and looking under rocks and inspecting all kinds of things. I always loved natural history. And one of the things that started to fascinate me quite a bit was when I would go to some of the ravines in Toronto with my parents and pick up rocks that I found there. And there were fossils on those rocks. And of course, as a kid, I was curious, what are these strange shapes that I'm finding? And as it turned out, there was a event at the Royal Ontario Museum that was held every couple of months called the Fossil Gem and Mineral Identification Clinic. And so members of the public could bring in things that they had found and meet with the curators and learn a little bit about what those things were. And so I started to bring in some of the fossils that I had found, and the folks at the museum were incredibly generous with their time and started to share more information with me, which got me into the field and sort of developed my passion for paleontology. And so when I got a little bit older, I decided that I wanted to get involved at the museum. So I ended up doing a high school co-op program there, where I started to learn about museum work behind the scenes and working with some of the collections. And then that all kind of snowballed from there. I continued to find ways to stick around at the museum and help out in different ways, sometimes as a temporary staff member and other times as a student volunteer. And eventually I ended up doing my PhD at the University of Toronto and spending most of my time at the ROM. So when I started working at the Royal Ontario Museum, it was 2012, and that happened to be a pretty fantastic time to start out because it was actually around the time that a major new fossil discovery was made in the Canadian Rockies. So it's at a place called the Burgess Shale, which is very famous for its Cambrian age fossils. And it's been known for over 100 years, but this new site presented a huge number of new species of animals. And so we were really excited to start to work on that. And as I continued to work at the museum there, we ended up going back for a number of different field seasons at the new Burgess Shale sites around Marble Canyon. And we continued to make discoveries over the years, including a number of specimens of this new species, Mosura.
Your main focus is on the animals of the ancient Cambrian, a geological period that took place over 500 million years ago and saw the biggest ever radiation of new and different animals in our planet's history. Joe, can you give us a brief overview of the Cambrian period and why it's so significant?
Well, the Cambrian period is a time that's fascinated me for a long time because it's such a radical reorganization of our life on Earth. So it's a period that is roughly 500 million years ago, and we're talking about uh, a radiation of animal life that occurred over a time frame of roughly 25 to 40 million years, somewhere in that range. I mean, it depends on how you quantify radiations as well, right? Because of course there's some later radiations where you have organisms evolving to live on land, which would have been also quite significant. But I'd say in terms of the diversification of animal body plans, we've seen nothing like the Cambrian. And so prior to the Cambrian period, we had some very simple animal-like organisms, things like sponges and other filter-feeding organisms. Generally, these creatures weren't moving around very much, and they were feeding in simple ways like filter feeding of the water. And once we get into the Cambrian period itself, we get this radiation of a whole diversity of different groups of animals that we still have with us today. We know these different groups as what we call animal body plans. And what's really significant about this radiation of animal body plans is not just that we have the emergence of all of these groups that are still with us, but also the fact that these animals changed our planet in a major way. So they really changed the biosphere, they changed nutrient cycling in the ocean through their movement. So, for example, animals started to burrow deeply down into the sediment, which started to bring oxygen from the water into the sediment, and that opened up new opportunities for more animals to inhabit different environments. So, why exactly did the Cambrian explosion, as we so call it, happen? That's still a major question that we're looking to answer. So there are a number of different theories as to why it happened at that particular time and why it took the form that it did. First of all, there are environmental explanations. So, for example, some people have proposed that there's a rise in oxygen that's happening during this time that seems to be coincident with this radiation of animals. And so we know that oxygen is important for animals, especially for complex animals that move around and have complicated behaviors. So a rise in oxygen seems like a logical explanation for driving this initial radiation. The ecological interactions of animals probably played a big role in this radiation. So like I was saying, when animals start burrowing into the sediment, they start driving oxygen down, and that enables the generation of these new ecological niches where new organisms can adapt to inhabiting. We also have things like the origin of some of the earliest large animal predators. And the significance of this is that when you have large predators, those drive the evolution of the prey in reaction to that predation pressure, and then the predators themselves then co-evolve with their prey as well. So you end up with this evolutionary arms race between the predators and prey that drives further evolutionary change. And then the final category of explanations for the Cambrian explosion are those that rely on the genetic and developmental systems of the animals themselves. And so we know that in order for evolution to happen, we need the genetic raw material, the variation within the organisms that enables evolutionary change. And so potentially there's something interesting going on in the Cambrian where we have these young genomes and young developmental systems that are relatively unconstrained in terms of the changes that can occur in them. And then through time, some theories indicate that we might have had sort of a fixation of some of the variation that's possible within those animal body plans that enabled them to stabilize over the longer period of time. And so I think it's important to recognize that even though the Cambrian explosion is something that happened over a long period of time in human terms, 25 to 40 million years, it is something that is geologically quite quick. And compared to the subsequent 500 million years of animal evolution, we see a huge amount of evolutionary change that's concentrated in that initial period of evolution. So it's very interesting from an evolutionary perspective. I think it's one of the big questions that we can ask in our science. This guy here is a Opabinia, which is a close relative of the radiodonts, but it's quite a unique animal because instead of having a pair of claws at the front of its head, it has this nozzle-like extension with a sort of pincer at the end. And it also has 5 eyes. So if you thought 3 eyes was a lot already, then think again.
Okay, let's talk about this new discovery, a Cambrian animal that you and your colleagues have named Mosura fentoni. Can you describe this animal for us and also tell us how it was discovered?
So this is an incredibly weird-looking animal. It's hard to describe because there's really nothing that looks like it today. So it has a head with a pair of stalked eyes on the side and a third eye in the middle of its head. And it has a pair of these jointed, spiny claws with these very long, curving, sort of sickle-like spines. And it has a body that's made up of multiple segments. And the first few segments have these broad swimming flaps extending from the sides of them, which gives the animal a little bit of a moth-like appearance, with these flaps looking a little bit like the wings. And then the rear end of the body has this long section that looks almost like an insect's abdomen that's made up of multiple different segments. They have very small flaps along the sides, which wouldn't have been useful for swimming at all. But they do have lots of gills on the underside of the animal. So we think that that region would have been significant for this animal to take oxygen from the water that it was living in. And then it also has this strange mouth part, which is shaped a little bit like a pineapple slice with teeth lining the inside. And this is actually a mouth part that's characteristic of a broader group of animals that we call the radiodonts. That name means radial teeth. Now, you might know of some of the radiodonts if you know anything about the Cambrian, because there's an animal called Anomalocaris that's probably the most famous Cambrian animal, and it grew up to about a meter long. So it was one of the largest predators alive at that time, and it was a close relative of Mosura in that radiodont group. Mosura itself is only about the size of your finger, so it's a relatively small animal, although still decent sized by Cambrian standards. These fossils were found at the Burgess Shale, which is about 506 million years old. So this represents an ancient seabed that's now located high in the Rocky Mountains in Kootenay and Yoho National Park. Now, a lot of these specimens were found a long time ago. The first ones were actually found in the early 1900s by the discoverer of the Burgess Shale. And they were probably viewed at the time as sort of weird one-off oddities. They were put into the collection at the Smithsonian Institution and some later specimens at the Royal Ontario Museum. And they were never formally studied. So people didn't really know what to make of them. And at the time, we did what we often do for species that we're unsure about. We gave it a nickname. So it was called the sea moth, based on that moth-like appearance. And the specimens sat in the collections waiting for study and waiting to be further understood by future researchers. So when we started doing some of our work at Marble Canyon in 2014 and onwards, we ended up finding more specimens of this sea moth animal. And these specimens helped to catalyze our understanding of this organism. We knew about some of the related forms like Anomalocaris, and so we now had the framework to understand Mosura, and we realized that it was time to finally get around to publishing this animal and getting it out there into the scientific literature. So it's a story that's taken many years to come together, but I think it's one that was well worth the wait.
And I believe there's a certain reference to a Godzilla monster here, isn't that right, Joe?
That's right. So the name Mosura is inspired by the Godzilla monster Mothra, the giant moth. So we thought that that would be a bit of a fun nod to science fiction. I think quite often science fiction characters take inspiration from natural history and from biology, but this time we decided to take some inspiration back in the reverse direction.
A lot of days, even at the Burgess Shale, where we can make the kind of discoveries that we made today. My name is JOSEPH MOYSIUK, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and the Royal Ontario Museum. This has the marking here, solution.
Right.
One of the things that I was most excited about was this discovery of a complete specimen of an animal called Cambrian, which was actually the first species that I got to name. And it's very rare to find these things complete. We only have a couple of examples previously found, and this one is just remarkable looking.
So the Burgess Shale is a very special fossil site, and it's special for two main reasons. Firstly, it comes from the Middle Cambrian period, so it's right in the aftermath of that major burst of animal radiations, and it's showing us a lot of insight into that critical time in Earth's history. And the second reason is that the fossils at the Burgess Shale are exceptionally well preserved. So normally when we think of fossils, we think of things like bones and shells and teeth. These hard parts of animals are relatively resistant to decay, and so they tend to be preserved fairly easily. But at the Burgess Shale, we also find things like eyes and nervous systems and guts still containing the last meals of the animals. And so you can imagine that that gives us a lot of insight into these ancient ecosystems and the animals that inhabited them that we wouldn't get from any other fossil deposit. So it's very significant in terms of our understanding of life on Earth. And as a result, it's been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Well, Mosura fentoni is similar to Anomalocaris, a well-known apex predator of the Cambrian, but it also has some intriguing differences. Joe, what would you say is unique about Mosura fentoni?
Well, there were a few things about this animal that immediately struck us when we saw the fossils, and so we knew that this was a brand new species as a result. Maybe the most striking feature is the organization of the different body segments in this animal. So like I said, it has this sort of moth-like appearance, and that's because the first few segments are specialized with these large flaps for swimming, and the segments at the back end of the body are specialized with these very small flaps and these tightly packed bands of gills, which would have helped it with respiration. And so this is a feature that we don't see really in some of the other radiodonts like Anomalocaris, this differentiation and specialization of different body regions. But that is something that we see in some of Mosura's modern relatives, like the insects and the woodlice and horseshoe crabs, for example, where we have a front part of the body with segments and limbs that are specialized for moving around, and a rear part of the body with specializations for respiration. So that's a neat example of a feature that's evolved independently in this extinct animal and in some modern groups. It's something that we call convergent evolution. Another feature that makes Mosura really interesting is that this third eye in the middle of its head. And to us that sounds really strange. We can't really think of animals today having third eyes. Although you might actually be surprised that some animals have more eyes than you'd think. So for example, insects, we typically think of them as having these two giant compound eyes that they use to view their world. But many of them actually also have 2 or 3 simple eyes in the middle of their heads, which they use to help them orient themselves in their environment. Those little simple eyes might not be able to form images as well as the big complex compound eyes that they have, but they are really good at detecting things like the horizon line, which helps with moving around quickly. So potentially Mosura was actually doing something similar to some of these living relatives. Now, this is the second time that we've identified evidence of a third eye in a radiodont. It's not something that's known so far in all species, so it's an exciting finding. Another thing that's really exciting about Mosura is that it's incredibly well preserved, even by Burgess Shale standards. So we have evidence in this animal of preservation of the digestive tract, We have the nerves that are extending into the eyes of this animal. And if you hold the photographs of the fossils up against photographs of the nervous systems of living arthropods, the similarities are remarkable. So we have some evidence as to, the visual capabilities of this animal. We think it was probably a very visually focused predator. So it had excellent vision and was able to spot its prey and chase after fast-moving prey. And we also have evidence of the circulatory system in Mosura, which is really interesting. So the circulatory system in these animals is quite different from our circulatory system. They don't have veins and arteries and capillaries like we do. Instead, they have this tube-like heart that runs along their backside, and it essentially pumps blood, or the equivalent of blood that we call hemolymph, out through holes in the side of the heart and into this large body cavity, and this series of extended cavities that enter many of the different body parts, including the limbs and so on. And we call those body cavities lacunae. And so this whole circulatory system is something that we call an open circulatory system. And it is found in modern arthropods like insects and spiders and crabs. So it's actually quite a common circulatory system today, but not one that most people are familiar with.
You also have an interest in the origin of body plans. Joe, what is meant by the term body plan, and why is it important to not only the Cambrian, but to human beings as well?
When we talk about body plans, we're basically talking about a set of characteristics that defines a particular broad group of animals. So different groups of animals are characterized by certain features. Humans are a part of a body plan that we might refer to as the chordates. So we're linked with other organisms like other mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and also some other marine forms that are less well known, like lanceolets. So all of these organisms share certain features. We have a certain type of muscle architecture that's recognizable in all of us. We have features like gill bars, for example. And you say gill bars, well, that's not something that humans have, but in fact it is. So we know that some of the features of our bodies, like our jaws, parts of our inner ears, our voice box, and some of the cartilage in our throats, actually originate developmentally from structures that we recognize as being equivalent to the gill bars in fish and other early chordates. And so these features that we recognize as part of that shared body plan can change radically in terms of their form, but ultimately we still recognize them as being the same and being descended from some sort of common ancestral form. Now, what's interesting about animal body plans is that at the level of comparing different body plans, it's very difficult to actually find those sorts of similarities at all. So think about the difference between the chordates like humans and other vertebrate animals, and say insects and spiders and crabs, or squid and clams and snails. All of these organisms have incredibly different body forms. They do have some basic similarities, like for example, they share eyes, although those eyes are extremely different in terms of their form and function. So maybe there's some common, developmental underpinning and some common early cell types that were shared by these different animal body plans. But in general, these are highly distinct groups from each other. So in the taxonomic classification system of animals, we generally equate animal body plans with high levels of classification, like the phylum level. So this is the level that's just under the animal kingdom itself. And so we're talking about a very high level classification into these distinct categories of animals. Now, the Cambrian period is interesting because it's the time period when we see the emergence in the fossil record of essentially all of the animal body plans that we still have with us today. So prior to the Cambrian period, we have things that we identify as probably being animals, but we can't necessarily tie them to any living body plan because they lack the features that characterize those groups. Then we go to the Cambrian and we get this radiation of the modern body plans. And after the Cambrian period, we haven't seen the emergence of any other major animal body plans. So this is quite a fascinating phenomenon in terms of thinking about evolution at the largest scale. Why is the evolution of body plans so confined to this geologically brief interval in Earth's history?
Well, it really is amazing work that you and your colleagues are doing, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to take the time to come onto the show today. So, what's next for you? Any upcoming projects that you can tell us about?
Well, speaking of animal body plans, I'm really interested in some of the factors that might have contributed to the evolution of these animal body plans in this brief interval of Earth's history, and especially in the sorts of genetic and developmental signals that we can infer based on the fossil record. So I'm working on a project looking at different arthropods, so different relatives of insects and spiders and crabs, to try to understand whether we can link some of their physical forms to certain underlying developmental patterns that might have been shared or might have changed through time, and how that may have actually impacted their evolution in the Cambrian and after the Cambrian period. So stay tuned for some more on that in the future. I'm also quite interested, now that I'm in Manitoba, in looking at some of the rocks here, which also show exceptional fossil preservation similar to the Burgess Shale. These particular deposits are a little bit younger than the Burgess Shale, at about 450 million years old. So they tell us a little bit about what happened to some of these early animal groups, how animal body plans had continued to diversify over the next few millions of years after the Cambrian explosion, and what was the fate of some of these groups that didn't necessarily make it to the modern day. And of course, on the museum side, we also have some exciting developments coming up. We have a new exhibit at the Manitoba Museum that will be opening up in December, and it'll be featuring for the first time a specimen of Mosura, as well as some of its close relatives like Anomalocaris. And we'll also be having some special events happening at the Royal Ontario Museum to celebrate their 50-year anniversary of researching the Burgess Shale. So I'll be taking part in a panel discussion in October of this year, talking about some of our findings and some of our work at the Marble Canyon site.
Joseph Moysiuk, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure sharing.